Greetings from Corona Bunker, where we remain well stocked, well armed, well prepared for lockdown 2020. Hope all of you are doing equally well. I know it's kind of an awkward, stressful time. This is not certainly the ideal way to conduct courses. Certainly not the way I would select to conduct courses. Hopefully y'all are managing. This is not ideal for any of us, and I apologize that you're having to take my class just listening to my mellifluous voice and not actually seeing the glory that is me, prancing around up at the front of the class, acting like an idiot, which I mostly do. But we are shifting gears from hazards and threats and bad things happening to discussing downtown historic preservation and infill development. So looking at how we can change our development patterns away from sprawl and more efficiently and more effectively use areas that are already developed. So through revitalizing, rehabilitating, reinvigorating downtowns by using vacant space and underdeveloped space within our existing development footprint, and looking at historic properties and the value they bring. So lots of stuff to dive into today, and we will jump into it. So the historic role of downtown really was the employment center. If you remember way back 14 years ago when we started the semester and we talked about the evolution of cities and how cities initially were very small because people walked everywhere and they had to be fairly small. We saw lots of mixed uses in early cities because, again, people walked to work or lived where they worked. In the case of shopkeepers and those kinds of things, you had the storefront with either the living space behind it or above it. And so people lived in proximity to their work, so the cities were very small. And most people worked in downtown. That's where the jobs were. It was the center of commerce and retail, so it brought people in. Even if they weren't technically working, they still had to go into downtown because that's where the shops were. So everybody was coming and going into downtown. It was very vibrant because there was residential uses in the downtowns. These areas were thriving at all times of day and night. So it wasn't like downtowns in sort of the post-war period that we'll talk about, where there was activity during the day, but then everybody left at 5 o'clock when the offices closed. Everybody drove out to the suburbs to their homes. So back in the day, we saw that mix of uses and the vibrancy of a thriving downtown. And there was very high density housing. Again, it was either over the retail spaces or it was apartments, very dense residential developments. Moving out from the core of downtown, you would see things like townhomes. So think about much of New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, where they have like the brownstone townhomes. So just blocks and blocks and blocks of 3 and 4 story residences, very dense development. So that was kind of the pattern, and not the individual single family homes that we see in the suburbs today. So the downtowns created identities. Each downtown, in cities had its own unique architecture, its own character, its own mix of businesses and stores. So every downtown was different. And that helped to create culture and heritage and connection to place. Today, if you drive into most suburbs, you spin around 4 times, you don't know where you are, right? Because all the suburbs look the same. They all have the same stores. Our big box shopping centers all look the same. So it's really, there's no identity or character being created by today's sprawling development patterns. It's just, as James Kunstler calls it, the geography of nowhere. It's just faceless, generic architecture, faceless, generic stores. They're all the same everywhere. So downtowns historically were unique and different and had their own special sense of place. They provided a range of services all together. So you had your grocery store, your hardware store, your tailor, your dry cleaner, your business, right, your office space. All of that was together. So again, people were coming and going at all times for different reasons. Lots of justification for going downtown because there was lots to do, see, and be part of. And there was all of this all of these uses created opportunities to interact, meet your neighbors, meet people. You'd run into people on the street, right? So you had those sort of chance encounters and casual interactions that help build a sense of community and foster social capital, right? Again, things that we don't have now because we're all driving to different places and we're not spending time in any one particular place where we have the chance to build those relationships. And there was enough density to support transit because, again, all the jobs were located in the downtown. There was enough residences in the downtown as well to have people there. So you had density that supported buses and streetcars and those kinds of facilities. So the decline of downtown in the post-war era, the Interstate Highway Act played an enormous role in helping to destroy downtowns. So the Interstate Highway Act built highways through many of our established neighborhoods, changing the character and culture of downtowns, making them more automobile dependent and less pedestrian friendly, changed the mix of businesses, wrecked some of that social cohesion that had built up because those neighborhoods were, demolished to make way for the highways. Additionally, it allowed people to move out of the cities into the suburbs where we were more spread out and, again, don't have places that foster social cohesion. We had white flight, movement of people to the suburbs, again, the people who could afford it and the people who were allowed to because of things like redlining and segregation and those public and private policies that restricted the movement of minorities into suburbs. All of that contributed to urban decline, and the jobs began to follow the people. So we started to see offices, retail, all of that began to move out to the suburbs because that's where the money was going. And so all of those businesses wanted to follow the money in the rooftops. And so that contributed to loss of employment, loss of revenues in downtowns, and that loss of revenue contributed to further decline because cities could no longer afford to maintain enough police to maintain safety, couldn't maintain road and other infrastructure, so couldn't maintain the schools. And so we just saw this cycle of decline that pushed more and more people out of cities, further reducing revenues, further increasing decline and blight. So again, you get that vicious downward cycle that happened in many of these cities. We've seen a similar pattern in downtown, rural downtowns. So bypasses are an enormous challenge for many small towns where the highway used to run through the city. It would slow traffic down, it would create congestion, but it was great for business because everybody had to go through downtown on the highway. And so you had a lot of people who were like, oh, we're hungry, let's stop for lunch. And so they were stopping at local restaurants, or like, oh, you know what, I need a blah, blah, blah. So they'd stop at the local store and pick that up. When the bypasses were built, it took all of that traffic out of the downtown, so it made it really hard for the businesses to survive. And what was built on the bypass were largely like fast food restaurants and chain stores. And so then people were driving on the bypass, and when they stopped for lunch, they'd go to McDonald's as opposed to the local diner. And so we see significant decline in downtowns, in rural communities, the decline of rural employment, the decline of agriculture. All of that also are taking potential customers and business away from our downtowns. So all of that's contributing to downtown decline in these areas. So some of the early responses to decline were pedestrian malls. Cities thought, well, since cars are creating problems, let's take the cars away. So they, take 3 or 4 or 5 blocks of a street, block it off to traffic, create a pedestrian mall. They've seen some success, like Pearl Street in Boulder, Colorado was an example of a successful pedestrian mall. 16th Street Mall in Denver did pretty well for a while, but they've actually begun to rethink that and move away from being pedestrian only. State Street in Madison is another example of one that's been pretty successful, just encouraging people to use that space and access it. False facades were another. So in many downtowns, if you drive through, you'll see that what is probably a really beautiful brick building is covered in like a funky aluminum siding or facade. And so buildings that could be really attractive were made to look more modern. The idea was that if we're going to compete with these new shopping centers, we need to look like new shopping centers. And so historic buildings were covered in these funky like 60s and 70s facades that now are being removed as people recognize that that was a bad choice. Kind of like mullets and some of the styles from the 60s and 70s, bell bottoms and the like. People are recognizing that was bad. Let's not do that anymore. So we're starting to see more emphasis put on maintaining the original appearance of buildings. But again, that was a way that cities were trying to compete with the suburbs and the new shiny stuff that was being built. And we saw a lot of stadium and museum destination development, but a lot of it was done really poorly. So we're going to talk about some examples of cities that have actually done stadiums and museums really well to create destinations in their downtown and bring people into downtown. But oftentimes it was done really poorly. Oftentimes what they did is they would put in, like a big old football stadium, and we can make fun of the Chiefs because, they're the Chiefs. And then they surround it with these giant parking lots. And so what you've done is basically create a giant dead zone in your downtown that's, super lively 8 or 10 times a year when you've got a football game happening there. But the rest of the year, you've just got this giant desert of empty parking space, and it doesn't actually enliven your downtown at all. It can destroy your downtown because you've taken all this space and turned it into empty parking lots. Coors Field is an example, and again, we'll talk about it in a little bit, of a city, of a project that actually is great for downtowns. Coors Field was built in a blighted area of downtown Denver now it's called Lower Downtown, and it was in an old warehouse district. It was really run down, unsafe, unappealing. But what they did is they designed the stadium to sort of mimic the architectural character of the area. So we talked about the importance of complementary architecture when we talked about urban design. They didn't surround it by giant parking lots. They made it accessible by transit and walkable from the core of downtown, and it's really done a lot to enliven the rest of the area around the stadium. New businesses and bars have come into that area, new loft warehouses have been transformed into loft apartments, and it's become a real destination. So again, we'll talk about that in a second when we get to that part of the lecture. So in the 21st century, we've seen a resurgence in downtowns. We've seen new investment in residential, retail, commercial uses. Lots of residential uses in downtown. Austin, Texas, for example, it went from, I think there was 1,000 residential units in downtown Austin back in the early 90s, and they're on their way to 25 or 30,000 or maybe even more by now. So significant increase in high density residential developments in many of our cities. So that's a trend. Businesses are starting to relocate back downtown. So offices, headquarters of different corporations, a lot of those businesses that had moved out to suburban office parks in the 60s, 70s, 80s are recognizing the value of being in downtown and the recognizing the importance of being in a cool place as a way to attract employees. So they're moving back downtown and helping to reinvigorate and revitalize downtowns. But this is not everywhere. So some cities are really successful at their downtown improvements, like Austin. Austin, Seattle, New York City seeing a big resurgence, even parts of Detroit. But what we're seeing is that a lot of the improvements in revitalization, even in places like Detroit, it's very localized. So it's the core of downtown, maybe 5 or 10 square mile area, but the remaining 300 and something square miles of Detroit are still blighted and declining. So even areas where we see improvements in the core of downtown, much of the city remains struggling and not a place you want to be. So it's not a universal benefit across downtowns. So what's driving this change is one of the biggies is changing family characteristics. So we see more childless families, young people who, not even young people, but people who are choosing not to have kids at all or waiting much longer to have kids. So, rather than having kids in their 20s, they're waiting till their 30s. sometimes even into their early 40s. And so they have a much longer period of time from, say graduating college to starting a family where they want to live in the city, right? They want that sort of cool lifestyle of the urban environment. They don't have kids, so it's relatively easy to live in a city. You can have a smaller space, a loft apartment or a small condo or whatever, because you don't have kids and don't need that much space. Also more empty nesters, so older couples or older people who are kids are gone off to college, grown up, moved out. They don't need the big house in the suburbs anymore, so they're looking to downsize, and they want that kind of vibrancy of an urban environment too, that they can, have their condo, come downstairs to the wine bar, go to dinner, walk to dinner somewhere, walk to the theater. So that lifestyle is certainly appealing to older people as well. Businesses, even with telecommuting and Zoom and Skype and all of these technologies that we have to connect people virtually, there is still a value to person-to-person in face-to-face communication. And so businesses are recognizing the value in being in proximity to one another, and so are choosing to locate in areas where they can have those face-to-face meetings and conversations. Cities are investing in their downtown amenities and attractions as a way to attract people back into the downtown, recognizing that they can build their revenue and tax base by attracting businesses and people into the downtown. And workers want cool locations. Employees are more empowered to choose where they work, and so we're seeing employees with the skills that are in demand being able to say, I want to work in a cool city. I want to work in Asheville or Madison or Austin. I don't want to have to work in Sheboygan, or sorry, if you're from Sheboygan, I probably shouldn't say that. Let's make fun of somewhere else. Say Dubuque or Sioux City, Iowa, or something like that, right? I want to work somewhere with a cool downtown with lots of cool bars and brew pubs and things like that. And there's the recognition that we've already invested lots of money into the roads, water lines, wastewater lines, all those things to serve our downtowns. And so if we can focus development on those areas where we've already made that investment, it's going to save us money in the long run because we'll have less to maintain and we're taking advantage of money we've already spent. We're also seeing more interest in suburbs kind of creating their own downtowns. In that post-war period, suburbs were really about residential development. So they grew up with single-family residences. Maybe they had a couple office parks, but these were, not places anybody would want to go unless you had to work there. So they didn't really have much else to do except for the offices. So they were, super lively from 8 to 5 and then dead after 5 o'clock and on the weekends. So we're seeing that suburbs want to create an identity. They want to create a sense of place. They want to sort of mimic the urban environment. And so we're seeing in many places suburban malls being turned into pedestrian mixed use environments. So the pictures here are Belmar in Lakewood, Colorado. So it was an old suburban mall called Villa, what was it called? Anyway, whatever it was, your typical, auto-oriented suburban shopping mall with a huge ass parking lot. The shopping mall with its JCPenney and Gap and all of the stores that a suburban shopping mall had, it started to decline. So the city stepped in, worked with a developer to demolish the shopping mall and turn it into a mixed-use walkable space. So now you have 4- and 5-story buildings throughout, residential up above, retail on the bottom. It's created a downtown for Lakewood, which had been just your conventional suburban development. Now, these can be pretty neat places. I mean, this Belmar development is pretty cool. It's got your same sort of national chains. There's nothing really special or unique about it, but it's better than the old auto-oriented mall, which had this giant parking lot creating basically a dead zone in the middle of the neighborhood. But one of the challenges that these kinds of developments have is that it's all private space. So whereas in a real downtown, a real urban downtown, the streets are public, the sidewalks are public. So if you want to have a protest or a demonstration, you can do so, right? You're in the right of way, you're in public space, and you can do that. Because these new suburban downtowns are largely private space, you don't have that same freedom of action. So we're actually, mimicking public spaces, but they are in fact private, and that can limit behaviors of people, and they don't have the same freedoms they would have in real downtowns with public space. So suburbs, like I said, are trying to create identity, create a sense of place. They're trying to compete with urban downtowns. Again, as I said, the employees have more power over where they work, and they want to work in cool places. So the suburbs are saying, well, we want to be cool, so let's, make a cool place where people want to go. And that's what's driving a lot of this. And we're seeing that mixed use and density is a better investment because we're taking more advantage of the infrastructure necessary to support that development. We're generating more revenue than we would from your typical, suburban shopping mall or other use. And so it's a better investment for these suburbs to make to support this new style of development. And it's attracting new retail commercial opportunities as well. So in rural downtowns, what we're seeing is a recognition of the importance of identity and the importance of character. And so those false facades that we're trying to compete with the new strip centers are being removed, reflecting or allowing the historic appearance of the buildings to be recreated or fixed up. And so the unique identity of the buildings is celebrated rather than trying to make them look like modern strip centers, trying to attract more retail businesses. And there's kind of a competition between destination retail or local use retail. So think about, I think we've talked about this, the difference between the mix of businesses you see in, say, downtown River Falls versus Stillwater. So Stillwater is very much a tourist town. So in their downtown, you see a lot more restaurants than you see in downtown River Falls. You see a lot more boutique stores, that kind of thing. Whereas in River Falls, because it's more geared towards the local community, you have a bunch of bars, but they're not really intended to be destination bars for tourists. You see, thrift stores, local service-oriented businesses. So it's a different mix than what you would get in a tourist-oriented town like Stillwater. And, that can be a good thing one way or the other. I know there's a town in Texas called Fredericksburg, and it's a huge tourism destination. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so every business in their downtown is a boutique of some kind. Wine bars, art shops, fancy kitchen shops. And it's great if you're a tourist because it's a fun place to go and spend a day. But for the people who actually live in Fredericksburg, unless they're rich and own one of those boutique businesses, they hate it because, their downtown is overrun with tourists every weekend and they can't shop locally, right? The businesses are all geared towards taking those tourist dollars. So the locals have to drive somewhere else to do their shopping. So, you have to kind of balance the needs of your local population versus that tourist identity. So, what's driving this is an effort to fight rural decline, give a reason for people to stay and spend money in these communities, give economic opportunities for people who still live in the town, right, and create reason for people to stick around if they can. They want to compete with businesses on the bypass and the big box stores. So again, trying to create reason for people to spend money at the local stores, generate tourism because tourism is economic development and can be a great source of revenue for cities. And it's important to preserve historic assets. Those buildings have, that unique character and identity that's important, and the heritage that they represent for the town matters. And so you want to preserve that if you can. So some common strategies for revitalizing downtowns. One is to create destinations in the downtown, but as we talked about, you have to do it right? Just throwing a stadium surrounded by parking lots into your downtown is not going to generate much business because those stadiums aren't used all that frequently. And when they're surrounded by parking lots, they're just a dead zone. So again, the example of Coors Field is a great example of how to seamlessly incorporate a stadium into your downtown. There's retail opportunities, like the fan shop is there, so people can go in even when there's not baseball games happening to buy, Rockies paraphernalia and so forth. They've also put in a really cool aquarium, and it's in proximity to Coors Field, again, on the light rail, so you can get to it without driving. It's very integrated into the fabric of the downtown, so it's a very pedestrian-friendly environment, a really nice place to go and hang out. So you want to make sure if you're going to use these destinations in your downtown that you make them part of the fabric of the downtown and not creating barriers by putting in a ton of parking. So allowing residential uses in downtown is important. Because what residential uses do is they bring in that 24/7 activity. So you're not having businesses that shut down at 5 o'clock when the workers go home, and then you have a dead zone till 8 a.m. the next morning when workers come back. If people are living in your downtown, you have vibrancy, you have reason for businesses to stay open later. So you're increasing the safety because you have more eyes on the street, right? So lots of benefits to having, that 24/7 activity in your downtown. And it can be either through mixed use development, so having your residences on top of the retail, or through standalone retail residential towers and other residential structures in the downtown, just whatever makes sense. But allowing that mixed use and density can make an enormous difference. Having festivals and events can help bring people into downtown who otherwise might not. And so, they bring in a different crowd than may normally be in your downtown. Now, they can also be problematic for business owners. If you're blocking streets and closing off access to local businesses, they may struggle because people come down and go to the vendors and the artists and so forth at your festival, but then they're not going to those local businesses, so they can be blocked and lose business. So you have to work very carefully with your business owners if you're going to start holding a bunch of events to make sure that they're not harmed by the activity. But in the long run, they tend to increase business and bring more people around. So they can be like kind of annual events, or they can be regular events like farmers markets that happen every week. And so relatively small scale activities that again bring people down for they go to the farmers market and they're like, oh, it's lunchtime, let's grab lunch while we're down here, and so they buy lunch at a local business in the downtown or whatever. So you can foster activity and interest in the downtown through those kinds of things. And you want to coordinate to make sure, again, that you're not going to harm business by these activities. Improving pedestrian access makes an enormous difference. You want to give people a reason to walk around, because if they spend more time in downtown, they're going to spend more money in downtown. So think about how you design your pedestrian space to make it welcoming, to make it feel safe, to make it comfortable for people to walk around. So example like this here looks like an alleyway between two buildings. Instead of being a dead space, they put in these nice water features, some landscaping, some cool lighting, and they've made it into a welcoming space that otherwise could be a dead space that people wouldn't want to walk through. So again, you're encouraging people to walk around. Here they've used these stones and this stonework here to make benches, places to sit. They've put in street trees to help provide shade. Again, making it a more welcoming place for people to walk around. So including things like pocket parks and landscaping. Think about Veterans Park in downtown River Falls. It's a very small lot turned into a nice green space. Connects to the river as well, so that kind of a double whammy there of having the open space plus the connection to the park. Sidewalks, benches, lighting, and safety, all of those things are going to make it more comfortable for people to walk, which means they're more likely to walk. Think about your businesses. So again, thinking about your mix of businesses between those that cater to locals versus visitors and tourists, and who you want to attract to your downtown, and the kinds of businesses that you want to encourage. You want to think about having businesses with varying hours to help offset some of the impact of from like a sudden rush of people all at once. So you might have coffee shops and offices that'll bring people in during the morning and daytime hours, banks and so forth. You want to think about having bars and restaurants and other retail for the evening, movie theaters, like here in River Falls, we've got the Falls Theater in downtown, so that brings kind of a later crowd, which is great. And of course, we have tons of bars keeping a late crowd as well. So think about how you can generate activity throughout the day so you maintain that vibrancy throughout the day and night, and it's not just 8 to 5 and then it's a dead zone after that. You want to think about parking and wayfinding. So how are people getting around your downtown? Oftentimes you will hear complaints about, oh, there's not enough parking, but then that's because people don't know where the parking is. So you need adequate signage to the parking. Like here in River Falls, we have a public parking lot that's on 2nd Street. We saw it when we did our walkabout, but there's not really signage to it from Main Street. So people may come into town, drive down Main Street, not find a parking space, and leave because they don't know where to go. So you need to have adequate signage to direct people to the parking, and then you want to make the walk pleasant from the parking lot to the downtown. So if you, again, think back to our walkabout, when we saw that public parking lot, right, the access into downtown from that public parking on 2nd Street wasn't great, right? The crosswalk across 2nd Street, which is a high-speed road, was faded and not very well maintained, and it wasn't an appealing walk to get from the parking to the downtown. So that's an opportunity here in River Falls to make improvements to increase pedestrian access and traffic from the parking. Shared parking can be a great opportunity. So if you have, say, a bank and a bar, right? The bank has lots of business during the daytime hours. At night, the bar will pick up and have business. So that one parking lot can serve both of those businesses. So you're reducing overall parking space by more efficiently using the parking that you have. You want to think about getting employees to park somewhere else. If you've ever worked a retail job, right, they always tell you to park in the back of the parking lot to leave the closed spaces for customers. That needs to happen in downtowns as well. And then consider metered parking or other limit on parking time to encourage turnover so that parking spaces are available. And you want to think about your urban design. So making a more pedestrian friendly environment means bringing the buildings up to the sidewalk, right? As we've talked about, people like to walk along walls for whatever reason. They feel safer and more secure having a wall to one side as they're walking. So bringing the sidewalks up creates that sense of comfort and safety for pedestrians. You want to think about wide sidewalks, landscaping amenities, boulevards, pedestrian access. All of those things make a more welcoming and more comfortable urban space that's going to help businesses be more successful because people are going to want to spend time in that space. And historic preservation. We want to think about the value of historic buildings. They help to celebrate identity and heritage of places because the buildings are unique in their own way. The particular architecture that was used in a town oftentimes is unique. There's regional differences in architecture. So if you look at buildings in, old buildings in the Northeast versus old buildings in the Southwest, there's different character and design to them for reasons related to climate and geography and available materials and lots of reasons. So, recognizing the unique identity expressed through buildings is important. Leverages your assets that are already in place. You can use walking and bus tours. Highlighting your historic structures is a way to attract people to your town. Historic tourism is a huge growing part of the tourism industry. People want to know about history and cool places, and so having like a walking tour where you have an app on your phone that tells you about where you're walking, tells you about the unique buildings you're seeing, is a way that cities are leveraging their historic assets to increase tourism. And how do we pay for it? So bonds and certificates of obligation are long-term debt that cities take on to pay for long-term projects. So sidewalk improvements, street improvements, those kinds of things can be funded through bonds and certificates of obligation. Business improvement districts are organizations set up to fund improvements in downtowns or other areas. So that's basically the businesses come together and agree to pay either an additional tax or just a fee, to the business improvement district that can pay for things like security staff, cleaning, landscape maintenance, landscape improvements, other improvements that are needed to the downtown. So again, it's using the businesses who will benefit from those improvements to help pay for them. Public-private partnerships, development agreements. Again, that's ways that cities can work with developers to get additional funding for public improvements. So if a developer wants to put in a residential building into a downtown, say on a vacant lot, they'll partner with the city to provide maybe some affordable housing in that building, or maybe they'll partner with the city to do some additional landscape improvements or put in like a dog park in part of their lot that's accessible to the public that also lives in downtown, right? So things like that can be opportunities for private developers to work with the city to make improvements. TIFs and TERSs, so that's tax increment financing or tax increment reinvestment zone. So that's a term for basically it's kind of a doozy to explain. Hopefully this will work without being in person to see your reactions to it. It's always hard to explain things when you can't tell if people actually understand it, but we'll try. So a tax increment finance district basically works as a way to develop additional funding for improvements. So we define a district and we say this area of our downtown is going to be a tax increment reinvestment zone. So if we're collecting $100 worth of property taxes in this zone right now, we the city are going to invest in improvements to this district. So maybe it's water and wastewater upgrades, it's sidewalk and road improvements, whatever physical improvements are made to that space. Because of those public improvements, now those properties are being revitalized. We're seeing new businesses located in there, and so now we're collecting $150 in property taxes from that same zone. If we have a TIF district or a TERS district in place, that new revenue, that $50 in new revenue that's being generated by the improvements that we made to that space, are then used to pay off the debt the money we borrowed to make those improvements. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, right? You're not taking tax money from other parts of the city for these improvements. You're taking the increased revenue generated by the property tax values going up based on the improvements that were made to pay for the improvements. So it's a way to focus development in areas of need and pay for it because you're collecting more revenue in those areas. So basically, instead of spreading the debt across the entire city to pay for improvements, you're focusing on the area that's benefiting from those improvements to collect the money to pay for them. Again, if you have issues or need to think about that more, shoot me an email or call me and we'll talk about it. So there's also the Main Street program, which is a national program to help revitalize main streets. They focus on 4 key ideas of organization. So helping cities and businesses work together to promote the downtown. Programming, so having events, festivals, working with businesses to provide needed services, those kinds of things. Design is about the physical design of the space, so ensuring you have attractive buildings, you have pedestrian amenities, wayfinding, all those things we've talked about. And economic restructuring, so working with local businesses to ensure they are successful, so providing business training, customer service training, all sorts of things like that to help local businesses be more successful. So here in Wisconsin, the Main Street program is administered through the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. So you can go to their website here and you can see the goals, you can see the program description. They work with Main Street programs across the state to provide coordination with the public and private sector. They do fundraising to help raise money for downtown improvements. They help engage in revitalization, and they provide technical assistance. So design projects, architects, planners, all kinds of folks are involved with the program to help downtowns be more successful and thrive. So historic preservation, the standards for historic preservation are set by the National Park Service. And so these are the guidelines and standards from the National Park Service, but all of the administration of historic preservation is actually done at the local level. So that's something that's important to note. The actual regulations and standards for historic preservation are done by local entities. So it's not a federal program top-down driving limitations on what people can do with their property. Everything is done at the local level. But these historic preservation is used to protect historic buildings and districts, and it's only worried about the exterior of buildings. So it's all about maintaining that historic exterior and preserving the appearance. And there are federal tax credits available. So when a developer wants to renovate an historic building, if they work within the NPS standards, they can get tax credits for that. That's the only time that there's actually some kind of federal enforcement for historic preservation, because if someone takes the federal tax credits for an historic redevelopment project and then doesn't follow the guidelines, they can lose those tax credits. So that's really the only federal enforcement mechanism. And there is some funding available for planning, rehab, architecture, design, those kinds of things. So it's about historic buildings and places. They can be individual buildings or districts. Local regulations within your historic districts can require new development to be complementary in design to the historic buildings. The point of historic preservation is not to get copycats. You don't want new development to try and look exactly like historic buildings. You want to be able to distinguish between old and new, but you do want to mimic the character of the historic buildings, so it kind of works together. So think again about campus. We talked about the complementary architecture and design of campus buildings. So if you look at, say, North Hall and South Hall, very historic buildings built a long time ago, and then you look at the UC, which is a fairly new building, even, you can tell the UC is a new building, right? The design of it, the architecture of it, says this is new construction. But because it uses that same brick material, it's got some common elements to the historic buildings, it's a complementary design, so it fits within the context and character of campus and the historic buildings, even though it is new construction. So that's what historic preservation is about. It's about ensuring the maintenance of that complementary appearance of an area. So some of the challenges that come with this are downtown is becoming playgrounds of the rich. So when we see this urban redevelopment happen, oftentimes it's not catering to the people who live there already. So those people are oftentimes pushed out by rising prices, rising rents, etc., changing character of the neighborhoods. So the corner bodega turns into a brew pub. So the people who live there don't feel welcome at the brew pub anymore, so they move away. So there's lots of reasons why character can change when revitalization happens, and the challenge that presents for maintaining existing neighborhoods can be pretty significant. So that's gentrification, when lower income, oftentimes minority residents are pushed out and they're pushed to the suburbs. So we talked about increasing suburban poverty and the challenge that presents. You lose local services and businesses, oftentimes in the face of revitalization. Local businesses can't afford to stay, and so you'll see local businesses get replaced by national chains, and so you can lose the identity and character of a space because of that transition. And this may not be forever. A lot of revitalization is being pushed by young people, but as young people are aging and starting families, they're oftentimes moving out to the suburbs for the same reasons that other people moved out to the suburbs. They want a better place to raise their kids, they want more space, they need a bigger house they can afford in the inner city, whatever it might be. So there's some debate as to whether or not urban revitalization is a long-term trend, or if it's going to slow down or maybe reverse in the next few years. It's something to be seen. Okay, so the activity for today's lecture, and this one's going to be kind of a long one, so we've still got brownfields and revitalization to talk about, but I'll kind of work pretty quickly through that. But I want you to think about your perfect downtown and either draw it if you're a drawer, or list out those things you would want in your ideal downtown, what it would look like, how it would function, what kind of businesses you might see. So again, you can draw that or you can just write it out. So if you draw it, take a picture of it, post it to the Canvas site, or if you write it out, you can just type it into the Canvas site directly. So whatever works for you. All right, so brownfields and infill development is about the reuse and redevelopment of formerly industrial space, typically. So brownfields, the formal definition is formerly developed land that offers an opportunity for redevelopment and reuse. Oftentimes these are contaminated sites. So if you had, say, a manufacturing site, or even something as innocuous as a dry cleaner can often have significant contamination. Gas stations can be contaminated sites, right? So these oftentimes are contaminated sites that offer opportunity for new development once they've been cleaned up and made available. So brownfields reduce your tax base. They are blighted, unattractive, unsafe spaces. They can lower tax base, lower values on adjoining properties. They can threaten public health because there is contamination. They promote vandalism and other social ills, right? So lots of negatives to having brownfields in your community, right? They're a place where bad things can happen. They can attract, homeless. They can attract crime, prostitution, those kinds of things, because they're unsupervised space with lots of places for people to kind of get out of sight and do things they shouldn't be doing. Redevelopment of these sites can be an enormous challenge because of the costs of dealing with the contamination and cleaning the sites up, making them available for redevelopment. If you're having to deal with contaminated soil, contaminated water, potentially hazardous waste that needs to be disposed of, right? That puts an enormous burden onto prospective developers, and they're not going to take that cost on. So, those sites will often sit for decades because of the costs associated with trying to clean them up. So, to turn the brownfields into an opportunity, you've got to figure out what is happening on those sites, what the contamination is. So you need to do a detailed site assessment to evaluate issues and opportunities, and you need to overcome the fear to get people to support redevelopment of those sites. So the benefits of revitalization and redevelopment of brownfields can be the revitalization of urban spaces, because again, these are oftentimes located in downtowns, in desirable areas. Riverfronts are oftentimes where we see a lot of these brownfield sites and industrial sites. So by turning them into a positive, you can create a lot of energy and change in your community. You can reduce sprawl by focusing development on areas already served by infrastructure, reduce the threats to public health, improve property values and aesthetics. So, these examples here, turning just a blighted abandoned lot into a nice community park, an old gas station into a fast food joint, right? An old blighted whatever this was into a nice community garden, community park, improves the appearance and opportunities in those neighborhoods. So infill development is about focusing development in vacant and underutilized space in the existing urban footprint. So you can look at the example here where you've got a couple of vacant lots, you've got some parking lots that could be something more functional and more useful than parking lots in vacant space. Oftentimes we see up to 30% of land within communities is vacant and undeveloped, so we have enormous opportunity to concentrate development within the existing urban fabric, reducing sprawl, reducing all of those challenges that go along with sprawl, and more efficiently and effectively using our existing infrastructure. And this is what all of that underutilized space looks like. If you look at this aerial photo here, you can see all of these red squares are underutilized lots or parking lots that could be turned into something more useful. So it leverages your existing infrastructure investments. It produces higher tax revenues, right? You're not collecting a lot of tax revenue on parking lots or vacant land. It improves your walkability. As we've talked about, parking lots can serve as a barrier to pedestrian access. They're not desirable places to walk. They're not attractive. They're not comfortable. So if we can reduce parking lots, we can make it more fun and more accessible for pedestrians. Contributes to character because, again, parking lots don't have any character. They're unattractive and detract from character. And it helps to foster that sense of place and connectivity. So it's also much more valuable than conventional urban sprawl development. So this is an example from Asheville. The land consumed by a Walmart in Asheville is 34 acres. Property taxes per acre is $6,500 versus downtown on a 0.2 acre lot. This 5-story building here is worth property taxes per acre about $634,000 per acre. So the retail taxes that are collected are about $47,000 per acre. Versus $83,000 per acre. Residents on the Walmart site is none. You get 90 residences in your downtown area, and the jobs are much higher as well per acre. So we can see that your conventional downtown development is much more cost effective and produces much more revenue for the city than your conventional sprawl. And here's some other examples. And these are not super fancy nice. Like this looks like a pretty nice fancy building, but these are just kind of your typical downtown buildings, stuff like what we see here in River Falls in Adel, Iowa. But you can see this Health Mart's about $1.3 million per acre. Napa Auto Parts, a national chain, but in a small footprint historic buildings, about 1.4, and so forth. So again, you have opportunity versus the Walmart, which is about $1 million per acre. So again, your downtown buildings are much higher value per acre than what you see in other types of development. So when we do infill and redevelopment, we provide sites for local businesses and startups. Oftentimes these redevelopment sites can be a lower cost option. So new businesses may have more success locating on these sites. Startup businesses like breweries, those kinds of things, take advantage of these redevelopment sites. And we're going to keep more money locally. So you can see the example here. If you shop at Amazon, you get about 14 jobs for every $10 million spent, and about $14 in chain stores. If you spend $100, about $14 of that $100 stays local. So that money, most of the money you spend at chain stores leaves the local economy. Whereas if you're shopping at an independent retailer, about $48 stays local. So you're getting a much bigger bang for your buck and keeping dollars locally than you otherwise would. So how do we do this? First step is to develop the vision. How can these underutilized properties be redeveloped or repurposed? So this is Stapleton Airport in Denver. This was actually a project, my master's, when I got my master's degree, I worked on the Stapleton redevelopment project. That was my research assistantship job that paid for my master's degree. So just some advice, if you're going for a graduate degree, get an assistantship that will pay for it. So apply to enough schools that one of them offers to pay you to go to college. Don't go into debt to pay for a master's degree. Find someone else to pay for it. But you want to have a vision for what the land can be used for. In the case of Stapleton, it was obviously a pretty huge area given it was an international airport. And they created a vision of a mixed use community that provided a range of uses from your big box retail to kind of a neighborhood village feel. They had a vision for the entire property and put it into place over the course of 10 or 15 years, and it's a pretty great development now. You want to inventory your potential redevelopment sites and prioritize them. So figure out which ones are in locations where it makes sense to do redevelopment. What are some ones that are maybe causing them or creating a potential hazard for our community that we need to deal with, whether it be through contamination or whatever, and prioritize them based on opportunity they create for revitalization and redevelopment. do the site assessment. And again, this is oftentimes paid for by the public because private developers don't want to make that investment until they kind of know what they're going to be able to do on the project. So this is where public investment in doing this work can be a significant part of it. So you do your site assessment, determine whatever contamination issues and so forth might exist, determine what the potential reuse might be for that site, and kind of start to develop a plan for the project. Clean up the property if needed. So again, in order to make the sites available for redevelopment, cities will oftentimes pay for this in partnership sometimes with the state and federal governments, because again, developers don't want to bear that burden of doing the cleanup or the responsibility for the cleanup. And so having a site that's ready to go and provided to developers can be a real benefit for cities. And there is some funding for this. So there's brownfield grants through the EPA that can help pay for the assessments, revolving loan funds to pay for cleanup. And so oftentimes cities will take these revolving loan funds, clean up the site, and then use the tax revenue generated by the redevelopment of the site to repay those loans. There's grants available as well. So again, opportunities for cities to get funding to make these sites available for redevelopment. Find your partners. So find developers who are willing to work with you on the redevelopment process. Come up with a vision and a plan and implement the plan. So the link here is to a news story about airport redevelopment. This is what Stapleton looks like now. You can see the incorporation of some significant green space, a variety of housing types mixed together. You've got duplexes, single family homes, some higher density housing over here. So you have that mix of housing that's available, lots of green space, lots of accessibility and so forth. So that's the process for dealing with brownfields. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of money, but you can create some enormous opportunities in your communities by doing so. So that's it for today. Hope you're doing well. Have a lovely rest of your day, and I will talk to you next time.